All right, so again, our question series for the day, our topic for the day was based around the question of how do we go about tackling an orchard for thinning that has 80 varieties in it? So to address that question, we're bringing in some of our big guns, some colleagues from around the country. So we have Dan Donahue from Cornell Cooperative Extension, Eastern New York Commercial Horticulture Program. We have Phil Schwallier, who is retired from Michigan State University, and I believe still farming at Schwallier's Country Basket. Is that right, Phil?
Yes, that's correct.
And also we have Tom Kohn joining us from North Carolina State University today. So I think with that, we're going to go ahead and I'll just kind of break the ice a little bit here. I know that's kind of a big question, how do we go about thinning an orchard with that many varieties? So I guess the first thing I want to ask you all is, how much of that is hyperbole with some of the orchards that you work at? Um, as far as some of the orchards you have around you, how many varieties do some of the ones have? Are we having orchards that have 60, 80 plus varieties? I mean, I know I've seen them in some of my regions, but I'd be curious to hear how often you see that on some of the pick your owns. And then just kind of initially, how, from what you've gathered with them, how are they kind of tackling things and how effective do they feel they are able to do things? So I don't know who wants to respond first. Um, Phil, do you want to take that one first?
Well, okay, I'll take it from my area. I see Amy Irish Brown is on too. She's got more recent visits to farms than I do. But anyway, yes, that's becoming more prevalent. Here at our farm, we've got 50 different varieties uh, for pick your own. So I've got that same problem myself.
Sure. And
Mhm.
Dan, what are you seeing in the Hudson Valley?
Well, in doing a little prep for this, made some calls, and I learned that I have one farm. This doesn't surprise me, but they have 106 varieties of apples. And what's nice is they label everything. Every row has a sign, which is an extension specialist's dream because you can just roll up and you don't have to try to recognize, especially in the dormant season, what's out there. But it's interesting. There seems to be a lot of different strategies for approaching, in these smaller farms that are more agritourism or PYO, pick your own oriented. They have different strategies for tackling the question, which I'm sure we'll discuss as we move along.
Okay. And Tom, what about you? What do you see in your area?
Sure, yeah. The pick your own and small farm segment is pretty important to our small industry down here in Western North Carolina. I would say that I've not seen anybody really crack 100, but certainly in that 40 to 60 range is pretty common. There's one grower that I spoke to in advance of this meeting that was in the 80 plus category, which aligns very much with the subject today. And I think that just to maybe start off a little bit, there's no such thing as a one size fits all thinning program, and I think that but also there's a lot of ways that you could make this a lot more complicated on you or your crew than what needs to be, and it'll be fun to discuss this with the group.
For sure, yeah. Um, so I guess that kind of launches us right in. And before I go any further, just a little bit of housekeeping I forgot to mention. Feel free to ask questions in the chat box too as we go along. We'll be sure to address them. And we do have about 20 people in, so it's not a huge group. So if you want to unmute yourself and ask questions directly, you're certainly welcome to do that too. But I guess just to circle back through, um, we can start with Phil again. How do you tackle that on your farm, Phil? I mean, you mentioned you have 50 varieties at this point. What's your basic strategy there?
Well, thinning, the sweet spot is a very important time, but I'd like to start early at bloom, and especially the difficult thin varieties. So I would suggest that people label their rows by what's mostly in that row. Let's say there's Fuji at one end and Honeycrisp in the middle and Galas at the other end, whatever. So I'd probably tackle that row And that would probably be the easiest way to spray an orchard, by spraying the rows instead of spraying the trees, unless you want to do that, you can. But I would start with bloom sprays. If it let's assume that we got good weather, we got good crop, we got good return bloom. I'd probably spray maybe a bloom spray, and especially in the tops of trees. That would either be ATS or lime sulfur, or maybe NAA. And then I would spray the whole row and not look at the trees, just spray it, because they don't typically thin well at bloom. And then I would spray again, maybe the whole orchard, but the rows that I identify as being difficult to spray, the thin, I would definitely spray them with 7 or NAA combo at the 6 millimeter stage. Petal fall 6 millimeters, 7, be careful with honeybees. But I'd spray rows based on what's the majority of the variety in that row. And then I go after a sweet spot, but I'm interested to hear what others might think.
Sure, yeah. I have some follow-up questions for you, but why don't we rotate through everyone and then I'll swing back because maybe they'll address those for me. Dan, do you wanna go next?
Well, when I was in the spray rig, this was decades ago. I had a Raven spray controller in my more conventional Bertaux sprayer, and so I could vary my output, on the fly. So if I had a mix, maybe the mix was 5 parts in a pint of carbaryl, sort of a standard mix you might use. And it's strong, it's a little bit strong maybe on a Mac, a little light on Empire. But maybe you want to vary that. You just either, increase your flow or you decrease your flow on with the computer, or you do the same thing with speed and, to manage your output. And again, since uh, every variety is different in sensitivity to thinners and what chemistries actually work. Plus, you've got bloom density issues and fruit set issues. Phil just discussed, the timing. He described what he described was the nibbling approach, where you start with bloom, which is generally light thinning, but we hope that it helps return bloom. Although in the Hudson Valley, the last 2 years, we had significant thinning at bloom. So historically very unusual with that. But so that's one method. Another is mix up a tank, and if you have enough acreage to use up that tank, maybe it's a 500-gallon tank, you're putting 100 gallons per acre, so you put 5 acres, and you've got 5 acres of gala around, but they're all over the place. Well, you drive all over the place and follow the signs and use up the tank that way. Is another method. And I find there, of course, there are differences with the nature of the operation. So with a small operation where you have a lot of varieties, if they're a pick your own operation, I've generally found pick your own people are not too sensitive to thinning. They don't worry about it too much. They need good return bloom, but the PYO customer is not sensitive so much to fruit quality or fruit size. So they don't worry about it so much. But on the other hand, a farm down our way that caters to the green markets and other retail farm stands, where quality is highly important, then they look at it much more closely and maybe follow a nibbling approach, or at least put more thought into it.
Sure, thanks, Dan. Tom, I'm gonna pass the baton to you if you wanna
Sure. Yeah,
tackle that.
yeah. So sorry. Yeah, so I feel like it doesn't really matter if it's 80 varieties or if it's 2 across the farm. I think there are some principles that are conserved in this decision-making process. So one thing that I would just argue that becomes very important if you're trying to manage that number of varieties or that level of complexity as a manager, as a grower, that scouting these orchards and assessing some of the key factors that influence thinner activity, or if a block even needs to be thinned, is what's really critical and drives this process. And I would say that if a person's not out there every 2 to 3 days, or 2 to 3 times a week, looking at some of the critical factors like that return bloom, understanding the effect of cropping history on that block, knowing what the pollinator activity is, if there's any cold damage that's visible, what's your spur leaf health look like? Because that's especially important for chemical uptake and activity, especially if you've had some cold weather. And then you get into initial fruit set and other factors like temperature and the carbon balance. It's all critical. And thinking about this bigger picture, I couldn't help but just think really hard about. I don't know if everybody will be able to see this, but there's this beautiful reference that ought to look pretty familiar to one of us on this call. This apple thinning guide by Phil Schwallier that was written. It's got his 30th birthday this year, and I tell you what, I pull this thing out almost every year, and I still gain things from it, and it just really speaks to the quality of that. But that guide, it's a great resource to kind of just give a person of an idea of all the factors that they need to consider in this decision. But I really think that good record keeping and notes on a cultivar or by cultivar, row by row basis is pretty essential here. And then, much like Phil, I think taking a swing early, whether that's at bloom or at petal fall or both, is one thing that could be really useful because some of the options that you have early can be applied and can be effective across multiple cultivars and a large portion of that acreage, which can be really useful and interesting. And I could go through a lot of points here, but one thing I just want to really say is that if you're taking that type of information and you're really monitoring it, you can start to group some of these cultivars into clusters that would receive the same tank of material. And one final point I want to make is just to really be opportunistic here, because you might think, oh, wouldn't I love to apply a material at 8 to 12 millimeter? But if the reality is that you don't have a sufficient carbon deficit or you don't have sufficient temperatures to see a response, you're wasting your time and effort and energy. So you let the game come to you. Rather than trying to force something in those situations, I think is just a nice mantra to have if you like basketball. So,
All right, thank you, Tom. So I think from that initial pass through of asking you, well, I think we're hearing a couple, similar themes. Shoot your shot when you're able to, right? And that kind of relates to that nibble approach, which, for those that might not be familiar, that's kind of the idea of you try to nibble your crop load down, starting at bloom, then petal fall 12 millimeter. And then if you got to follow up at that kind of 16, 18 millimeter stage, you still have that opportunity to. But I guess a follow-up question I have for you all, when we're talking about 80 varieties, is it still feasible for us to really truly apply the nibble approach? And I think I am asking that and thinking about just logistically, phenologically, I go to some of these orchards and I say, what growth stage are you at? And they'll say, well, my Zestars are, 8 millimeters. My Snapdragon are just starting to open their petals. So I guess how do you keep track of doing the nibble approach when you've got so many different varieties at all these potentially different bloom stages? And Phil, I think you kind of addressed it to an extent. Talking about treating row by row. So, a kind of related question to that is, does it kind of come down to orchard arrangement a little bit, putting phenologically similar varieties close together, or I open that up to the group?
Well, certainly it does, but I'm thinking that you're just going to have to go out and spray a row and not pay any attention to whether or not you got a Zestar in it or a Fuji. Well, so I rate the rows based on how difficult it is to thin the row. The majority of the variety that you want to thin in there, and just go and forget the other variety. And that's why I say go early, because you won't over thin early. Typically you don't. Dan might have with, I don't know, what'd you use, ATS or lime sulfur in bloom?
We for bloom thinning, we generally use NAA, or NAD is becoming more popular.
I see. Well,
In the Valley, we haven't been doing much with ATS. Lime sulfur only became legal in New York as a thinner, what, maybe Mike, 2 seasons ago?
I believe so, yeah.
okay, so at that bloom stage, you'll get 5% thinning, maybe 10%.
Mhm.
And then at the petal fall stage, you get maybe 10 to 15. And if you have really the best weather for spraying, you get 20%. So I'm thinking thin across the board on all the varieties, and you probably get the easy to thin ones, or the ones that are just at the right stage. You'll probably get them down to too heavy, but they'll be down a third or something like that. Typically, you want to take off 50% of the fruit. So then you go early, you can't overhurt anything. And then you come back later. If you got an easy to thin row, a majority of them are easy, go with 7 alone or NAA at a low rate. That's my approach when you got so many different varieties in a block. And then at the 10 millimeter stage, then you got to watch what you're doing a little bit better. And you might have to walk through a row and say, hey, I better hit this row again because it's got too many of these big, difficult, thin varieties. Or you thin the tops only early or mid or petal fall. You come back at 10 millimeters and you got to tighten up what you're doing because of the different that's a sweet spot, and they will respond. Typically 50% will come off at 10 millimeters, 10 to 12 millimeters. So I think before 10 millimeters, the risk is low and you get some reward.
Okay, great. Yeah, so kind of regardless of the variety, you can, because it's a pretty safe time to thin, go out and put some thinner on and get the work started. And then at 12 millimeter, you can kind of fine tune things row by row.
Right. And you'll have to come back and look at them like Tom said, go every 3 days. And thank you for the compliment, Tom. That was very nice of you.
Oh, it's the truth, Phil. It's not just a compliment. No, that body of work is excellent. It probably needs to be redone, honestly. And I think that, it's interesting discussing this with this group. It's probably time that a group
Oh,
gets
yeah.
together and starts to modernize it and include things like carbon balance. And it still has Excel in here as a thinning option. So we've got new products and a lot of things that could be done there. So, yeah.
I just want to make mention of that too. Thank you, John, he put a link to a PDF version of that in the chat box. So for anybody who wants to have a look at that, feel free to grab it there and download it so you have that reference. So thank you both for sharing that.
Phil did that when he was just a young guy. So like Tom said, it's old, right, Phil?
Oh, yeah. It's just like me.
But it's, yeah, just like that's the point I was making. But seriously, it's got some really good basics in it. I did get permission, by the way, to publicize that from.
That's fine, John. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, John. So I guess just to circle back to Dan and Tom, if you had any additions to make on Phil's points there, again, kind of referring back to the question of different phenological stages or how you like to arrange or how the growers you're working with arrange their crop in their rows. Do they kind of think about easier or difficult to thin varieties? Are they grouping them together, or what have you kind of seen in the successful orchards around you?
Well, Phil was very, thorough in describing, how we do it basically and how we should be doing it. How the grower implements that, though, depends on, to some extent, who's doing the spraying. So, many of the operations we're talking about with a large number of varieties and they're more agritourism or farm market retail oriented, they're smaller operations, so they don't have large staffs. In some cases where the owner is operating the sprayer and that person attends all those extension meetings and reads and knows all the details and what to manipulate. But then it all seems to go to hell once they turn it over to the farm manager or somebody else to do it. And then they feel like that it's not possible to make all those changes on the fly, like adjusting your spray pattern, the upper canopy, the lower canopy, all this stuff that we talk about. So that's something to consider. I always come back because we we talk about precision thinning, and there's a lot of science that we understand. But the way I describe thinning is it's a combination of art, science, and dumb luck. And which is more important in any given year changes. And it's not always predictable. So, sometimes, particularly some growers can talk themselves in and out of doing something, mostly talk themselves out of doing something. And it comes down to the whole psychology of this. And I think it's fascinating how growers look at this. And, you've got one group of growers that are scared to death and they talk themselves out of doing anything. Because the weather's going to change, or I don't know. I think I had poor pollination. Those are the two things. Then you've got the middle group that comes to the extension meetings. In our case, they read the e-alerts. They listen to what Mike and I are saying for our area. And then you've got the third group who don't listen to us at all. They're experienced thinners, and they do what they want to do. And if it's 85 degrees and the sun beating down, they have a heavy gala set, they have no problem going out with a full rate of Maxell plus Carbaryl and having at it, even though we might in theory tell them don't do that. So the psychology of the whole game to me is fascinating.
I agree, Dad. I definitely see that gamut, and like you said, the orchards could be 10 miles down the road from each other, and they view it very differently. So there is certainly that psychological side of it too, and just how it kind of fits into your business model. So
Dan, I
certainly
think
a lot
your
to keep
growers
track
are
of.
my growers.
What's that? What's that, Phil?
I think your growers are my growers.
I think it's a
Same
pretty
one.
common, yeah. Do you feel like during, the thinning period, say, bloom through, 20 millimeter, you can cut the tension with a knife? I mean, the growers are so focused on this.
And then you get to know the growers, and so you change your recommendation based on what category they fall in.
Well, exactly,
Mhm.
exactly, and what technology they might be. Those that are very squeamish about thinning, they don't like the uncertainty, so they're very receptive to precision thinning techniques. They're the ones that are open to measuring fruitlets and using the spreadsheet model, using the card model. Basically, they're looking for something or someone to tell them what to do.
Right.
Please tell me what to do.
I'm standing next to my sprayer. I got it full of water. What should I put in it? I said, put
Yeah.
plus NA. You can go out there and spray 100 gallons
hmm
there.
Then the group on the other end of the perspective, Dan, I went out there and I put that stuff on. It was hot, but I'll be fine. Yeah. Okay.
My
Talk to them
favorite is
later.
whenever go ahead, Phil.
No, Tom, that's all right.
I was going to say my favorite situation is whenever you get the call of, hey, what would you do on this variety? And then they say, well, I've already done it and I've done something different, so it's kind of, they're second guessing themselves all the time. But no, Dan, you're spot on. Human psychology in this is a real thing. And I think the number of people that are willing in research and extension, at least, that are willing to kind of stick their neck out and make suggestions or guidance in this area, there's not many of us that do this still, that can actually give detailed recommendations on a variety basis. So any of you that's on the call, just know that your effort is really valuable if this is an area that you're working in and can gain that experience to help growers through this process, because it's unlike any other input that I can align with. There's other things that you can do that are very calendar based or very cut and dry with rate, but so much nuance in these decisions that it makes it really difficult. Yeah.
That's a great point, Tom. It's certainly thinning's the one that keeps me up the most. Luckily, one grower told me, "Don't worry, Mike. I'm going to take what you say. I'm going to take what my consultant says, and then I'm still going to do my own thing. So don't worry too much about your recommendation to me." But
Correct,
what I like
Mike.
to joke about too is we're kind of tough because we can go too far on either side. A stink bug can't be too dead, in my opinion. But we can overthin. So it's definitely the one that keeps me up the most.
Some of my growers have said, we don't care if you're wrong, but we want to know what you think.
Hmm.
So, and oftentimes I've told my fellow extension agents, Amy Irish Brown and all the rest of them, if they call and say, should I thin, say yes. Get them out there going.
Yeah, so under thinning is more common than over thinning.
Recording in progress.
Seems to be the case. So I wanted to have a couple more questions here, and I think we have a couple weird echoes coming in, so please just double check that your microphone's off if you're not a speaker. We would appreciate that. So another question I had, just thinking product wise, I know for our thinning recommendations, there are some products, some varieties that we prefer to use an NAA thinner on. Sometimes we prefer to use a 6BA. So I'm kind of curious to hear if there are any particular ones where you really want to keep it one or the other. I've seen in a lot of recommendations that Cortland doesn't like 7. So I wanted to get a little clarification on that. Certainly like with Honeycrisp, we tend to not want to use a 6BA product on there because we don't want to end up with grapefruit at the end of the thinning season. So just wondering if any of you have any thoughts on what particular products are better suited for particular varieties, or if you go to that level.
Who are you asking? Anybody?
Full group, yep. Whoever wants to roll with that first.
Okay, well, NAA is the workhorse thinner, and so is 7. Those are the two most important ones. And Fuji and Red Delicious, NAA is not good on Fuji and Red Delicious. With Maxell, I've never really had a problem with Cortland, but I will tell you I use NAA on Cortlands. They're usually easy to thin, so you don't have to hit them too hard, or maybe once or twice. And 7, I haven't had a problem with 7 on anything. Well, maybe there is. I wouldn't know about it unless you guys could tell me.
All right, thanks, Phil.
Yeah, the only
So I've over the years gained a lot of respect for the value and importance of carbaryl in the thinning system. And maybe it has to do with our just unstable weather we have, certainly in the Northeast. And so it's not speaking for Washington State where things are more stable, but our weather, which goes hot and cold, dry, rainy, carbaryl is sort of a slow acting, steady thinner. We don't really know how it acts, but it works. And you can take into account rewetting to get more efficacy. I'm in the camp that believes that there is a rate response to carbaryl. There's another school of thought that says there is no rate response to carbaryl, but I think that there is a rate response. So I really think carbaryl is a cornerstone of the thinning program. And when the weather goes bad, and we've had some years where that petal fall, bloom, petal fall, and into even 10 to 12 millimeters has been, 60 degrees outside, 60, 62 degrees, very, very chilly. That NAA carbaryl combination still works and still can be relied upon. So I think that's a real cornerstone of a thinning program.
Thanks, Dan. Tom, do you have something?
Yeah, I'm in a little. It's like being in a different country almost whenever you compare North Carolina thinning programs to that of the Northeast, and that's just something
Sure.
that the regionality of these decisions becomes really, really a key factor, because I think that we get different responses down here. We in some cases have warmer and better weather to see responses during our bloom period. So in many cases, we're pretty fortunate to get strong responses out of chemistry that you might not on certain varieties further north. But I feel that, our thinning toolbox is bigger than ever. That's one thing I just want to point out. So we've got the 6BAs and the NAAs, the NAD, carbaryl, all those that have been mentioned. But what's really exciting as a young pomologist here is just to know that there are new options on the table. And I think that it's our responsibility to begin to understand how we can integrate these new options into our toolkit. So there's really 3 products that have been released in the past few years probably one of the first ones out was Exceed from Valent Biosciences, which is a rescue thinning option that is to me quite a bit safer than that of Ethifon. And that when I say rescue thinning, that's whenever you're getting out there near that 20 millimeter fruit size where you have very limited options of effective material. And the alternative is a product that's an ethylene generating product that we've not discussed to this point called Ethifon. And that material is known to be extremely volatile, and its response is really strongly dependent on weather, more so than other chemistry. So that's just to have a new option there that also doesn't need to be mixed with carbaryl is a useful thing. New this year to us on the East Coast at least will be Brevis, which is an interesting product. It's a product that we know the mode of action. It's a photosynthetic inhibitor, and what's neat, that's another dose-dependent product that you don't need to use carbaryl as a mix partner necessarily. So it's really exciting when you start to think about these combinations and new programs for certain situations. And to kind of go back to that phenology-based question that you mentioned there, Mike, of can you even do the nibble approach if you have some trees that are just starting to enter bloom, others in the same row or orchard that are at 8 millimeter fruit diameter? One thing that can be a real challenge in these small pick your own situations where you have a wide range of a diversity of varieties is just that you've got trees that are just blooming and you have bees in the orchard still, and it can really result in some management challenges because you've got that wide range of phenology in an orchard. So I really feel that, especially in the Eastern United States, we need to start thinking about that bloom and petal fall thinning timing to think of options where we don't have carbaryl in that tank for that type of a reason, because it's possible that you could go in with a low rate of a product that could be kind of a one size fits all. It's not going to do a perfect job for most varieties, but maybe there's some options there to really have more flexibility and cover more rows with a single tank rather than having to really tailor this across the board. But I hope I'm not dodging your answer or your question about what chemistry to use and with specific cultivars, but I think that Phil hit on that there's some issues with problems, certainly NAA on Fuji and Delicious, that can be an issue. But what's nice is that there are so many different paths to get to your end spot. There's so many different routes with chemistry, and it's always fun when you start to talk to growers about what they use. And I learn new things all the time about combinations and timings that I never would have tried. And some of them can be very effective programs, and it's exciting. So I think that we're in a really neat position here to be able to help growers in ways that we haven't been able to before because we've had advances in new chemistry.
Thank you, Tom. I am curious to hear. I've been playing around with Exceed for the last couple of years. Tom, have you been using it down in North Carolina? Have you been seeing it on Gala or Honeycrisp or some of the other big varieties?
Yeah, I mean, majority of use in my area, at least from a commercial perspective, has been Gala, Red Delicious, Fuji is another one, and it's really interesting. I talk with my colleagues at Valent, and for whatever reason, our environment, we see some really nice responses with that product relative to other parts of the country, and we can do a really nice job with that product at 20 millimeter on Gala with the lower end of the rate, that 200 to 250 parts per million of Exceed, where I think others are needing to go a little bit higher or consider mixed partners. But no, it's been, for us, it's been a very exciting, reliable product. And I think I've done about 9 trials with that product, and I've seen thinning responses in about 8 of them. So, I mean, for me, it's been very exciting from that perspective. But I acknowledge and realize that, again, not one size fits all. Our region and our environment is so different at that stage that I don't want to pretend that it's going to work up in the Northeast. Yeah.
No, for sure. Thanks, Tom. We do have something in from the chat box. I think we'll have a look there. Ian mentioned he has 165 varieties to thin in 15 acres. More power to you. Ranging from early blooming crab apples to hard cider varieties blooming a month later. Impossible to precision thin, but we aim for the middle. Planting your orchards and rows with bloom time in mind is critical. NAA mid-bloom helps. spraying at night to protect bees from carbaryl is a must for petal fall. You have to accept that you can't thin everything optimally, so you just live with it. Thank you, Ian. I appreciate you adding in those sentiments. And by all means, it's a small group. If you'd like to turn your microphone on and discuss that anymore, we'd be happy to have you. 165 varieties, man, that is a full-time job right there, no doubt.
I don't recommend it.
Duly noted. So let's see, I'd like to invite other people to add your questions into the chat box. I still have a few more, but I'm sure you're all probably getting tired of hearing me talk so much. So I do invite everyone else to start asking their questions. Erica mentioned in the chat box, it's more economically damaging to underthin, but more emotionally damaging to overthin. Yep, I feel like we've all been on that end of things before too. So it is that balancing act for sure. So I do have another question that I can ask of the group, but again, I invite anyone else to chime in as well. We're working. I know a few people have been involved on the Pac-Man project, the precision crop load management, and Ian already mentioned that 165 varieties, impossible to precision thin those. And I think it is probably the limiting factor there is just the fact that we do have all those different varieties with all those different phenologies and whatnot. To give everyone that amount of precision would, there's not enough hours in the day. I feel that way when I'm looking at 4 varieties, let alone 165. But I guess the question that I'm slowly getting towards is with the advent of some of the different precision ag companies that are out there, with the potential that growers might be able to scan their orchards, look at bloom, look at bud development, all of that. Do you perceive we in the near future might have more capability to get more precise on orchards with more varieties, or is there just more, essentially just natural factors in the orchard that is going to limit that ability for us to really get into in these types of environments? So maybe a big philosophical question, but Dan, what do you think?
Wow, I think the pomological world every year is getting more complicated, and more sophisticated, more variables. When you factor in the number of rootstocks we have available now, the number of varieties, new varieties, what we need to learn about the interactions just between rootstock and variety. And then never mind, and of course, planting system. And then the resources that we don't have anymore to look into all these variables. And on top of that, for pomologists, to really get good data, the studies are complicated and they're intense, and not to say anything negative about entomology or pathology. I guess I am an entomologist by training, but it's one thing to, evaluate the efficacy of an insecticide when, you might get 70% damage in the control and you manage to control it down to 5%. So you have big differences and all, and you can do counts. In pomology, if you're looking at things like fruit set or effects on fruit size or effects on fruit color, your sample sizes really need to be huge. And you need to be very sophisticated about your use of statistics and your experimental design. And those studies are very expensive, very labor intensive. So, in one direction, we're getting more complicated, more possible combinations, but we have, especially in pomology, fewer and fewer resources to do it. So I don't hold out actually much hope that way, unfortunately. Although the remote sensing, I think where there's hope would be in the remote sensing end of things. Something like precision thinning, we've tried it in the valley, and I have one grower that's massively into it. I mean, 60 blocks, 2 crews of 2 people out there doing all the measurements, running the model, and invariably they get the information a day later than they needed it. And honestly, it hasn't helped their thinning program. But they're in the category of being nervous thinners. So they may not act, on what they have. So, and again, pollen tube model, I did a lot of work with that in 17, 18, and 19, and came to the conclusion that I think it's a fantastic program. It's really well thought out. But in the Hudson Valley in New York State, during that time of year, during bloom, we have such a high rate of rainfall and rainfall incidents that invariably 50% of the time it gets in the way. The model tells you to spray 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, but you're in the middle of a 12-hour rainstorm. And by that point, you've missed it. So it's hard in our climate in the Northeast to implement a lot of precision, unfortunately. But others might have a brighter viewpoint than I do. In Washington State, it's a completely different ballgame in what they can do.
Certainly. Bill or Tom, any thoughts?
Go ahead, Tom.
Sure. So I had the luxury of working on that project, that precision cropland management for Apple project. And John Clements might be another person to chime in here because he was focused in on some of these ag tech solutions as well throughout the course of that project. But I think what's interesting when you start to think about ag tech in general in orchard systems is that there are a lot of these companies that are working to develop solutions for growers, which is great. I would say that probably a higher percentage of them are looking for solutions for large industries and large clients, So that's always something that I just, anytime that I start talking with a new company or new startup, just to make sure that the small and medium-sized growers also can have a product that's worth testing and trying, because I just feel like that's actually truly where there's more growers in that category and potential to make more money, but also it's underserved, in my opinion. So we looked at multiple vision systems to see if we could count and size fruit and also predict fruit abscission as part of that project. And I only looked at two. Some other groups like Terrence's group and I think group in Michigan and Washington looked at more technologies, again, because I'm from an industry that's quite a bit smaller and wasn't a prime target for some of these companies to really look at. But there was one that we looked at that was a cell phone based system that it looked pretty promising. It could count and size fruit pretty well, at least until you got to about 200 fruit per tree. But then once you got to more than that, a lot of occlusions and issues, and it wasn't necessarily a high quality result, which was unfortunate. That company is since out of the game. It's no longer there. Another company whose name I won't mention here, but we did a fair amount of work over the course of a season to look at that just to see if we could do yield estimations. We tried to predict fruit set with it as well. And I just didn't quite see the responses because we were going through and ground truthing this. We would harvest all the fruit from trees that were scanned, run it across an electronic fruit sorter to then be able to validate if the technology was actually accurate from both a number of fruit and also the size of that fruit. And we ended up with an R square whenever you look at the predicted results and actual of 0.3, which means that we only explained about 30% of the variation, which is not to me in the realm of acceptable. And then you start to look at some of the actual scans and images, and that technology was mistaking orchard trellis posts for trees, irrigation risers, because we had some overhead irrigation at the site that we used this on for frost protection. And then to make it even more insulting, we saw instances where they were also assigning 16 apples for that irrigation riser as well. So I do get excited about the prospect, and I think that somebody's going to crack the nut on this, but at least the technologies that I've had the privilege to look at aren't quite there. They're not quite ready for prime time, and where I feel a little bit challenged is that you get a grower community that wants some answers there and wants somebody to give some guidance on it, but I don't quite have that information across the board. But again, I'll stop there and invite John or others that have experience in that area to contribute as well.
Sure. Thank you, Tom. John, you wanna hop in on that one?
Well, I think Tom summed it up pretty well, and I agree nearly 100% with what he's saying. Unfortunately, the cell phone app that might have been, more cost effective and readily available for small growers, I don't think that they saw the money in it, which is a problem with this technology. You've got to have startup money and keep it going to get stuff developed. But although I'm not a big fan of it, Terrence Robinson will talk about precision pruning as the first step towards thinning. And I have reservations. I have a tendency to be a lighter pruner and not a heavier pruner, but I think as you're out doing your pruning, you might want to be thinking about bud counts and perhaps, where things look really good. And I don't know if this is across the board variety wise, but certainly for Honeycrisp, if you think you've got too many buds out there, spend a little more time pruning because that really is your first step to reducing crop load. In case I hadn't brought up, think about it. And I'll be thinking about it as I prune stuff and like want to move on to the next tree, but maybe I should take off a few more buds. That's all. And like I said, Tom summed up the Pac-Man work, I think, very well.
Thanks, John.
Okay.
Phil, did you have anything you wanted to add to that part of the conversation?
No, that's okay. I think it was well described. I wanted to summarize what I think you can do with all these different varieties. For example,
That sounds good.
I think you should identify rows of varieties by their difficulty to thin. That might mean floor levels: difficult, moderate, easy, and no thinning. And then I think I would start spraying those early, thin early. And once with the difficult and moderate to thin, make sure you get in there, or in John's point, Honeycrisp, you got to get return bloom. So maybe you should have value of the row as well. If it's got Honeycrisp in it, you got to start early to get that get the seed numbers down in the fruit and the fruit numbers down. Otherwise, you won't get return bloom on Honeycrisp. So spray them by the rows. Start early. Maybe you could spray the whole block the first time through, or bloom or petal fall, because you don't really get much thinning at that time typically. And then come back and do cleanup thinning where you need to, and consider top of the tree thinning. You think, well, maybe I don't need to thin this tree again because it looks pretty good, but the top's probably got twice as many as it should have. And do some touch up on rows that need it after the 10 millimeter stage. And then, as Tom got said about ACC, you can use that later to help fix problems that you missed. That brings me to a point. Oftentimes growers call me and say, they got it. I got to thin. I encourage them to thin. I encourage them to use combinations. And then they call me back at 16 millimeters and say, well, I didn't thin. Now what do I do? That's so frustrating. But anyway, thin early, use combinations, look at the top differently. And then once you get to 10 millimeters, look at doing cleanup thinning where you need to, by a row basis, because I'm assuming there's 3 or 4 or 5 varieties in a row when you got 80 varieties. Or maybe not.
All right. Thank you very much, Phil. That's a great summary of the main talking points here. I greatly appreciate that. Do anybody else have anything else they want to mention, or
Mike, just a
other
comment on
questions coming
pruning.
in? Yep, go
Just a
ahead.
comment on pruning, because we did talk about precision pruning, and if anybody in the group that doesn't know that, that's pruning to a flower bud load, a certain flower bud load, like maybe 1.8 to 2.5 flower buds per fruit that you want to set in the tree. So with that being said, a tall spindle or a vertical axe, any high density system intercepts light so well that it's very efficient in the production of flower buds. So it's not like a semi-dwarf tree or, God forbid, big old tree. So you have to really prune the trees pretty aggressively to get that bud count down. But the other factor I wanted to point out was the height of the canopy, because I see growers in my area making this mistake. Because once the tall spindle system becomes mature, and if they have the vigor, what they'll notice is the fruit in the upper 50% of the tree or up at the top is always the best looking fruit. So the logic is, let me grow that tree higher. So instead of topping it at 10 foot or 11 foot, I'm going to let it go to 14. So besides the unfortunate physics of that, and the fact that it could take the whole trellis down if things get out of column, it's like there's no free lunch. What you end up doing is marching the bearing surface up the tree. You're not expanding it, you're just marching it up the tree. So where the canopy is shaded down low, you get poor flower bud formation, less fruit set, and it thins easier. So that's something to take into consideration in the thinning decision, is to not let the tree get up too high, keep your light interception down low, and so you have a more even flower bud distribution. And if you are in a situation where your bloom is light in the lower part of the tree, as I think Phil has mentioned, you spray most of your thinner into the top of the tree, actually. Even though your per acre rate's the same, your spray distribution is oriented to the top of the tree.
Great, thanks, Dan. Yeah, I think certainly the importance of pruning, I think is great for us to be highlighting here. I know Erica put into the chat box too, she was re-highlighting that as well, particularly mentioning like last season where Ontario had a cold, wet thinning period for that 2 weeks. I know Western New York was in the middle of that too. Northern New York was on the tail end, so we did get some good thinning windows, but we can't rely on that. So certainly the importance of good pruning cannot be overstressed here. Tom, anything else from you? Anything else before we
Yeah,
go?
I would just quickly comment on the pruning piece. I kind of see that pruning to a bud count approach. It's almost it's reducing the ceiling of your reproductive potential every year, So I kind of think of it a little bit, and this might be a crude analogy, but a lot of people would go out and apply dormant oil to try to reduce insect populations and scale numbers, to try to reduce that insect population before things get started so that when you do have to treat later, you're not having to knock this population from way up high. You've already knocked it back a bit. So it's the same kind of principle with dormant pruning. It's just a lot more labor intensive and expensive as compared to a dormant oil application from an insect management perspective. So I do feel that there's a lot of value in it. I do feel like we might feel that we're precise in that area in some ways. And this is one of the more humbling parts of this process is if you've tried to go through and do this with any degree of accuracy, to make sure that you have that 1.5 times the bud load, or if you're trying to get 75 buds and you have a crew of people with advanced degrees at a research station that are trying to do this, it's incredibly humbling to know how far off you can be in that process. So I think we're all fooling ourselves if we're thinking that we're getting to these numbers in any accurate way, because the reality is you and I cannot differentiate consistently the difference between a vegetative and a reproductive bud. We might feel like we can, but in most cases, there's this category of buds that's in that murky middle that you just don't know which way it's going to go. And more often than not, you're wrong. So technologies that could help identify those buds would be a big deal, especially if they were non-destructive, because the only other way to get at it is through microscopy. So I do think there's a place for it. I think it's important in a management program, but I think just the process of going through and counting buds, but then knowing that you're reducing that crop potential, you don't have to get spot on, but it's still very much a worthwhile practice. And I do see one more question in the chat, so I'll pause there.
All right, thank you, Tom. I do want to address Jeremy's question. I'm just going to make note here. Leslie had also mentioned, just making notes on the starting bloom that you have. That way when you get to the end of thinning, you can see, you can refer back to what your bloom was like to figure out how that impacted your thinning results. That's an excellent point. Going through, we do have at least 2 more questions here. So I want to address Jeremy's. And Jeremy, I get this question every year, and I always forget to write it down. Best way to completely thin blossoms off of newly planted trees. What is your go-to mix? I'll open that up to the 3 of you. What do you like to use in that situation?
It seems like we have a collective pause, so I'll take a quick swing. So For newly planted trees, I treat them differently than I do a mature tree. So on a mature tree, my preferred combination is lime, sulfur, and oil. And the reason for that is it has two modes of action. It's a photosynthetic inhibitor, and then also it has pollinicidal effects. So it can actually halt or arrest the growth of pollen tubes. Even if it's grown about halfway through that styler tissue, it can still stop it. It's very effective on mature trees, especially in the East. If you apply it at least twice, it can be a useful material. However, it's a photosynthetic inhibitor, and 2 shots of a photosynthetic inhibitor on a young tree is not my goal or intent. So if I'm going with a caustic bloom thinning product, in this case, it's going to actually be ATS at 2%. And you're going to have to live with a little bit of visible leaf phytotoxicity, especially if temperatures are warm. But just always know that as long as you haven't removed or damaged over 1/3 of that canopy with those sprays, which I've only done that one time, and it's because I applied it during absolutely miserable drying conditions, that you can reduce that potential crop right there, and then not have that negative impact on photosynthetic capacity, but then have a really good recipe that you apply whenever you're at the most significant carbon deficit. And Jeremy, I can pass that recipe on to you, at least what we use in the Southeast. But it's a hot mix of Maxell, 7, surfactant. Some would even use like a crop oil there, but it's high rates. It's a defruiting mix, and it's something that I keep NAA out of that tank because that can have a negative impact on vegetative growth.
I agree with
Thank you, Tom.
I definitely would go at 10 millimeters, which is what Tom's saying. He go at the maximum carbon deficit, but that's usually around 10 millimeters. You got to put a spray in there. And I do like going at bloom with something I usually use NAA, but I can go with something, try something that Tom just recommended on lime sulfur oil.
Thank you, Phil. Dan, do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, just to mention that there's an alternative but complementary strategy that's being worked on. Wim Kogel's doing a lot of work with this and others, and that's the use of gibberellins or orange to inhibit flower bud formation. So applying orange, it might take a couple of applications at a high rate and just inhibit flower bud formation for the next year, and that can greatly reduce. It's not an inexpensive program, but it does seem to have some advantages in terms of tree growth because, again, you're not shocking the tree to get it to drop its fruit, and you're preventing it from actually producing even fruit up to 10 millimeters, which still saps energy from the tree. You know, when you have a young tree, you want it to grow and fill its space. So something to think about at least in the future.
It's an excellent point, Dan. I'm glad you brought that up. We've tested that material and I've been excited about it too.
Yeah,
thank you, Dan.
We've used that material twice on Honeycrisp, and it works. It reduces return bloom quite a bit. Usually 2 sprays. About 4 weeks after full bloom, something like that.
All right, thank you. And then we had a question from Ian, and I just want to point out too, John mentioned that same material suggestion, the Maxell 7 oil. I know that's one that we recommend on a regular basis at 10 millimeters to decrop the newly planted trees. Then a final question from Ian: has anyone tried Exceed around 18 millimeter for a rescue spray? I've used it on Gala, Honeycrisp, and McCown in New York 1. It's worked moderately well on Gala. I've had less success on Honeycrisp and McCown. New York 1, I'm still kind of playing around with it. Anybody else use it at that timing on any varieties? I think Tom had mentioned he's had good luck with it.
We used ACC at that time, 18 to 22 millimeters. Perfect timing for a seed.
Agreed. Yep. Just add the non-ionic surfactant at a pint per 100. And then I think that's pretty critical there. We've to try to make sure that we don't have to go too high on rate, like with Fuji, for example. What we've done is we've gone 300 parts per million ACC plus a pint of surfactant, and then we'll also add in 7. And you can use 7. You don't have to on all varieties, but that's a way to maybe get the biggest bang for your buck with that material late. If you've got something that's a little bit harder to thin, obviously you could still go up to 400 parts per million is legal with ACC, but I've been very pleased with that thinner, Ian, late.
Yeah, I did
All right.
7 so that the grower can sleep better at night.
So I've just had one trial on Gala. Didn't have much luck with it. Had great luck on peaches. However, I was on the phone with a grower in Ulster County yesterday that used it last year. And we had a weird thinning season where we had excellent bloom activity, excellent bloom thinning, excellent petal fall activity. And then for the 10 millimeter stage, the temperature fell off the cliff.
Cold.
And so 6BA wasn't going to work at all. It just basically had to get your thinning done early. He still had some late thinning to do because of that. And he went with the seed and he was singing the praises across several varieties. And this is a good thinner, very observant. So I need to pick his brain, look at his records, and find out exactly what he did and when he did it. But he was very happy with it.
That's good to know. Thank you, Dan. And funny enough, I was talking with Amaya Atucha out of University of Wisconsin, and she told me they had a couple grower trials with it, and they've had fairly promising results at that timing too. So it certainly sounds like it has a place for us. So with that, we are at the hour mark, a little bit past. So I think we'll go ahead and wrap things up here. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. We did record this, so the recording will be up in the next few days. I assume that's all right with you all?
Sure.
If I share that with the group?
Not a
Thank
problem.
you. And just a
Sure.
big thank you all to our speakers for joining us today. Appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule. Particularly if you have a big conference in Albany tomorrow. Appreciate you hanging out for that, and everyone else for joining us today. So thanks a lot, and we'll see you next week. We're having a conversation about fungicide, so join in for us then.
Thank you.
Have a good week, everyone.
Okay, thanks. Have a good afternoon.
Turned out
You
nice,
too.
Mike. Thank you very much. Yep.
Thanks, Tom.